Hi, my name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors here at the meeting place. Hi. We're starting a new series today. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're sitting in an art gallery, surrounded by artwork, some of it created by people who have long since passed on, but some of it was created specifically for the series. The series is about trying to explore who Jesus is. And all of the artwork, as you come here, should remind you that we're on this journey and that the art reflects particular people's impressions of Jesus and how they tried to capture specific moments in his life. The question that he asked in his lifetime here on earth was, "Who do you say that I am?" And the art is a response to that. We're also, in this series, limiting ourselves to the book of the Gospel of John. It's the fourth book in the New Testament. It's written by an eyewitness, someone who knew the sound of Jesus' voice, someone who knew precisely what he looked at, someone who knew what he smelled like. They spent enough time in close quarters in his lifetime. And so John writes for us this incredible account of what he discovered in his time with Jesus. And we have the gift of these reflections, these memories that John shares. Now, he records this later on in his life, which means that we have access to insights about Jesus right from the very beginning of the writings. It's not like there is a slow revelation of Jesus, but rather John writes in reflection as he looks back and says, here are some things that I can tell you for sure are true of Jesus. And what we'll discover is that the Gospel of John is full of titles and descriptions and characteristics of Jesus. In fact, sometimes it's hard to keep up with all the nuances that John includes, but this is our invitation for us to understand that John's writing is, in some ways, the response to the question, who do you say that I am? And then finally, I think we need to understand that in this series, we're going to be looking at the stories of specific people who have encounters with Jesus. Stories of people who were living perhaps a very normal, typical life, and then when they have this encounter with Jesus, suddenly everything changes for them. The circumstances of their life become different. And for us to notice the changes in the lives of these people will help us to bridge the gap between what was then and what is now. Because in some ways, the question then becomes our question, and that is, how might an encounter with Jesus change the circumstances of our life? The question, who do you say that I am, remains. It stands for us to respond to. So when I was 9 years old, I came down into the kitchen. My mom was making breakfast. My two sisters were sitting at the table having breakfast. Dad was already at work. There was a certain look that I saw in my mom's face that told me that she had some really exciting news. And she then proceeded to tell us that my sister Susan, who was a year and a little bit younger than I was, had decided to follow Jesus the night before when Mom had tucked her in. And so this was the news that she wanted to share with us that morning as a young family. Pretty good news. And yet at the same time, I'll tell you, because I was the oldest in the family, there was a part of me that's thinking, how did she beat me to this? This is crazy. I should have been the one to do this. I knew that I had to at one point decide what my relationship with Jesus was going to be like. But here, my sister had beat me to it. Well, that night, I'm lying in bed by myself in the dark, and I, as a 9-year-old, simply turned to Jesus and said, Jesus, would you be the Lord of my life? To the best of my ability, however I understood it, the little that I knew, or perhaps the much that I knew in the moment, was sufficient for me to say, I want you to live in my life. I want you to determine what I'm about. Well, you may ask yourself the question, how is it that these young children would decide or even believe that this question existed for them to respond to? Well, I need to give you a little background. So, my dad, as a 19-year-old, was living in a very strict home. It was a Christian home. His dad was a military officer. But as a 19-year-old, he understood that his older brother was going to inherit the family business, which was a construction company, and so he had some options to consider. And he decided that he wanted to pursue becoming a farmer. He wanted to be in the world of agriculture. And so he made some inquiries and discovered that there was a family in Canada So he was living in Germany. There was a family in Canada that would be willing to take him as an apprentice on their farm. And so Dad, if you can imagine, left everything that he knew, left all that was familiar to him, left his entire family, didn't speak a word of English, jumped on a ship and came across, traveled across Canada and arrived on this farm in Alberta. He enjoyed farming. And one day, he heard about that there was going to be this speaker that was speaking at the small church in Calgary. And so he and his friends jumped in a vehicle and they drove to this evening meeting. And the speaker was compelling and presented the cause of Jesus in such a compelling way that my dad, who was sitting in one of the pews like you and I sit here on a Sunday morning in these chairs and listening intently, came to the conviction that he needed to respond, that there was something he was being invited to, which wasn't just to be a Christ follower, but rather to lay down his life and say, Jesus, I will follow you wherever you may lead. And in order to illustrate that this was a commitment that he's making, in those days, this was in the 1950s, he pulled out of his wallet a crisp $20 bill. And he placed it into the offering bag when it went by, and he said to Jesus, this is my down payment. This is my first installment to indicate that I'm serious about serving your cause. So he returned to his farm, or to the farm where he worked, and said to this couple, this is what has happened. And they made arrangements for him to finish high school, because he hadn't done that, and then to go to Bible school. At Bible school, he met my mom. He was smitten immediately. Apparently, she was the most beautiful woman that he'd ever seen in his life. She was at first a little annoyed by him because, here was this strange foreigner, spoke with a funny accent, and he was clearly pursuing her. But the thing that made it intriguing is that, Dad had come to be a farmer, but she understood that he was at Bible school because he was no longer going to pursue a career in farming, but rather he was prepared to invest his life in the cause of Jesus to whatever degree. And here's the interesting thing. My mom was born into a family of immigrants that left the Soviet Union to come to Canada to be able to own land here and to have the freedom of expression in their faith and so on. And they were farmers. So she grew up on a farm and knew precisely what this meant. And even as a young girl decided, I'm getting out of this life as quickly as I can. This is not the life that I want. So this foreigner presented an interesting opportunity. And so even though she claims she never really said yes to him until her dying day, the truth of the matter is they did end up getting married and they did make a life together. So this couple now was ready to invest themselves. And so they went to Bible school, Bible college together, which is how we arrived in Winnipeg, which is where I was born here, and my sister Susan was born here. And then my dad was called into a pastoral ministry into this little country church back in Alberta, and that's where my youngest sister Judy was born. And then they received this call. There was a church in Germany that were looking for a pastor. And because, of course, my dad's language skills, they thought this would be the perfect fit. I wonder if he'd be willing to go back to Germany and serve in this capacity. And so the question came, and my parents had to consider. And they decided that they would do this. And so they left everything that had become familiar, everything that defined their life, their entire young family. I was 3, my sisters were 2 and 1, and we went off to Germany. And we spent the next 12 years there as my parents invested themselves in pastoral ministry in that church. So as a 9-year-old, when I was lying in my bed that evening, I understood precisely what it meant to follow Jesus. I had grown up in a setting where I had watched my parents make a very deliberate decision for Jesus to invest their life in a very different way. And this is all I knew. I knew that saying yes, even as a 9-year-old, would require something of me. It was a bold thing. It was a little bit like saying yes to an unknown thing. But I was about this. The Gospel of John is going to include stories that are going to inform us about what it was like for people to hear the call of Jesus in their life and then to respond. So let's get busy with it. This, by the way, is the very beginning of what we now call Christianity, Christian faith as expressed around the world. John starts with a very compelling statement. Here goes. It's incredible, actually. This is what he says. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. This is verse 14 of chapter 1. The Word is Jesus. And we could spend the rest of the morning just talking about what that means in terms of the significance. But we're not going to focus on that today. But understand that Jesus became flesh. John uses a very blunt word. He wants to make sure that we understand that Jesus did, in fact, become a human, even though he was the Son of God at the same time. He entered human circumstances, and it says he made his dwelling among us. The actual translation of that, the full meaning of that is he pitched his tent in our neighborhood. So he came and immersed himself precisely in our circumstances. And then John says, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. He introduces this glory thing. Jesus came and represented glory. This wouldn't have been obvious perhaps at the very beginning, but John writes about it again because he's reflecting on this at the end of his life. And he understood that as he'd spent time with Jesus, that he embodied something that was really quite extraordinary. The glory, if you look the definition up for glory, you'll discover that it often has to do with the presence, the appearance of God. And so God the Father entrusts to his Son Jesus this glory that becomes visible and apparent. Now, there's an interesting little thought here, because what is glory? What is the definition of glory? Well, there's a story. Way back when Moses, who is the leader of the Israelites, he's in the process of figuring out how to be the leader, and God's in the process of introducing himself not only to Moses but to this group of people. And so they have this exchange, and Moses says to God, I don't really know you. I have no idea what you're really about and what you're like. So would you please show me your glory? And God says to him, I could do that. So they make this arrangement, and Moses is hidden, it says, in the cleft of a rock. And it's like God's hand covers up Moses. And then it says, the goodness of God passes by. And God is very clear to say to Moses, you cannot look at me because you won't survive the experience. It's too big. So I'm going to make sure that you can't see me, but I'm going to allow my goodness to pass by. When you hear glory, understand that it's talking about the goodness of God. The goodness, the kind of goodness that you and I don't even know. We think we know what goodness is, but within God, goodness is the purest, truest form. There is nothing that is not good about God. It's an incredibly powerful presence. And this is the thing that God the Father entrusted to his Son Jesus. So he comes in glory. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, why is that important? Grace and truth. Well, here it is. As a 9-year-old, I am lying in bed at night. I understood truth. The truth that I understood was that even though I was only 9 years old, I was capable of making poor decisions. I could lie like other people could lie. I could shoplift like other people could shoplift. I could do all kinds of things that, in fact, I was quite overwhelmed by. I was feeling incredibly guilty about the fact that even as a child, I was capable of making such poor decisions. I knew the truth of my circumstances. Truth told me that there was something wrong with this picture. I needed a solution to this truth. And this is where I'd listened to my parents who told me about Jesus to say, here is Jesus, and he brings to us grace. He brings to us something that solves the problem of when we displease God because we don't quite measure up to the truth of his law and his moral code. So in the end, we want this combination of grace and truth for this reason. Truth by itself is harsh. Truth by itself is too much to bear. A relationship cannot survive by truth alone. But grace without truth is spineless. Just grace without the truth in play becomes powerless. It becomes of no value at all. In parenting, we understand that if we constantly support and forgive our children without them ever bearing the consequences, we're giving them a distorted picture. We're extending grace that actually distorts their sense of the reality of things. Jesus came and brought that perfect combination of grace and truth. And this is something that we will explore over the coming weeks as we study the book of John. Grace and truth are in play all the time. This is information we get about who Jesus is. And then John testifies. This is not John the writer. This is John the Baptist, who is a player in this entire story. He's a very important character testifies concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me.'" This is a confusing statement, but basically this is how this works. We just finished a series called Epic, and it allowed us to cover the story of the entire Bible over a number of weeks. And one of the things you notice is that there are characters and events along the way that allude to this coming Jesus, this person who is going to show up and who is going to rescue the nation of Israel. John the Baptist is the last character in that lineup. He's the last person to be the one to predict the coming of Jesus. Now, this is an interesting thing. The difference between John and everyone else before him who spoke of the coming of this Savior, of this person who was going to lead the nation, is that John the Baptist would experience this in his lifetime. He would not only say that Jesus was coming, but he would actually see him coming. And so in this instance, when he makes the comment to say, "The one who comes after me," because John is the one announcing the arrival of Jesus, was also before me, right? Because Jesus has been around since the beginning of creation. And John understands the complexity of this particular arrangement. So John answers the question as to who he believes that Jesus is. And he goes on. "Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." So this alludes to the fact that Moses was entrusted with the Ten Commandments and other descriptions of a moral code that was incredibly useful to build a community. People needed to figure out how to be in relationship with one another, and there were defining details of what that would look like, and they were also invited into a relationship with God, and those things were defined. So Moses understood truth of things. Following the law would reveal the truth, and you would be confronted by the truth. The concept of grace was present, but it came into fullness as Jesus showed up, as Jesus extended a kind of grace that we'd not heard of before. In fact, was never heard of before Jesus arrived and has never been claimed by anyone else. Grace is something that Jesus offers in a way that no one else in history has ever claimed. And then it says, "No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." Remember I told you the story about Moses who could not see God? No one can ever see God, but here is the interesting thing. This is another piece that John includes as far as our understanding of Jesus. If we watch Jesus, if we pay attention to him, we get to understand the character and the nature of God. He is the perfect representation of him. And so we have access without being able to see God the Father. We can see God through his Son. And he embodies that in his time here on earth. Okay, we carry on. The next day, John saw Jesus coming. This is again John the Baptist. Saw Jesus coming. This is the day. This is the day that John had been predicting for a while, and now Jesus shows up. He was coming toward him and said, "Look, the Lamb of God." This is the word, this is a title that John the Baptist declares about Jesus. The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This was one of the primary functions of Jesus. He was going to help us deal with the sinfulness of things. And so to use the symbolic language of lamb was powerful if you consider the history of the Israelite people. But again, we're not going to get too much into those details. This is the one I meant when I said, "A man who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me." A repeat of what I said earlier. "I myself did not know him, but the reason I came baptizing with water was that he might be revealed to Israel." So John the Baptist understands that as he's calling people to come and be baptized, specifically in relation to their sin, that in the context of that ministry, as people would gather and would listen to what John has to say, that Jesus would be revealed. And so Jesus shows up precisely as John the Baptist had anticipated, as he had been told. Goes on. Then John gave this testimony. John the Baptist, again, is telling us about what his understanding of Jesus is. And it says this, "I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remain on him, and I myself did not know him, but the one who sent me to baptize with water told me." So this is now a reference to God the Father, who had invited John the Baptist to be about telling people about Jesus. And he says, he's the one that told me that there would be evidence of how we could identify that Jesus is in fact the one that he says that he is. "The man on whom you see the Spirit come down and remain is the one who will baptize with the Holy Spirit." And there's another theme that likely will play in this series. I have seen and I testify that this is God's chosen one. John the Baptist, as John writes about him, is clear about understanding the role and the function that Jesus plays. And the story carries on. And now we get into the personal encounters. The next day, John was there again with two of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God," consistent in how he calls him out. When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. See, John the Baptist understood that Jesus would be greater than. He would be the better leader to follow. And so several people who have been following John the Baptist all along now turn and direct their allegiance towards Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following, and he asked, "What do you want? What are you looking for? What are you hoping for? What is it? How is it? Why is it that you're following me?" And they said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying? We just want to know where you're going because we want to meet with you there." The story continues. "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. It was about 4 p.m. Can you imagine these two disciples? These two that are interested in following Jesus get to spend the rest of the day with Jesus. What did they talk about? John doesn't include those details. What did they talk about? How did he introduce himself? What did Jesus say about what he was going to be about? What is it that gave them a sense that they had made a good decision to follow this new person called Jesus who just showed up, just arrived on the scene? This is what happens. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two. So initially they're unnamed, but then we discover one of them is named Andrew. And Andrew has a brother named Simon Peter. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah, the Christ, Jesus Christ." Christ means Messiah. Messiah means the anointed one. We have found the one. You know how we've been living in anticipation of this one that was going to show up and it was going to set the whole thing in right order. He was going to restore things. He was going to be that powerful leader. Well, we have found him. Andrew's convinced. He'd spent time with Jesus, and he goes and he says to his brother, "We have found him." And he brought him to Jesus, and Jesus looked at Peter and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. And the meaning of the word is, you will be called rock. Both Cephas and Peter mean the same thing. Now, if we track the story of Peter, we discover very quickly he doesn't behave much like a rock to begin with. He's very volatile. He's very emotional. He tends to be not very careful with his words. But over time, he becomes a rock, and he becomes an incredibly important figure in this movement called Christianity. He's given a new name, given a new purpose. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Now, this is interesting. I was really encouraged by these verses because here's the thing. There's one thing about people deciding to look for Jesus and to follow him. There's something else entirely about Jesus looking for people. So the notion that Jesus pursues us, that he's interested in having a relationship with us, and we don't know what the character of Philip is, we don't know exactly why perhaps he had to be called by Jesus, but I love the fact that it includes this. It's an interactive relationship. Jesus is interested in us as we are interested in him, and the reverse of that. I love the little detail of that. So blessings on Peter. What does Philip do with this? Watch. Philip found Nathanael. And he told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote." I said this to you earlier. The Old Testament writers alluded to the coming of Jesus, and now Philip says to Nathanael, "You know the guy that we've been waiting for as we've been studying the scriptures available to us? We found him." What's Nathanael's response? Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Right? Because Philip calls him like it's Jesus of Nazareth. He's the son of Joseph. You know, the carpenter that lives over that little, insignificant town. Nathanael is not sure. And then it says this. Nathanael says, "Nazareth, can anything good come from there?" Nathanael asked, "Come and see," said Philip. Philip has been a friend of Nathanael's for a long time. He knows there's no point in arguing with him. The best thing to do is bring him into the presence of Jesus, and this will make all the difference in the world. If Nathanael experiences this for himself, this will be the key. And then this happens. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there's no deceit." And Nathanael's walking up to Jesus, and he hears Jesus say these words, and he's thinking to himself, how does this person know That I'm coming with my doubts. I'm not hiding anything. I'm coming not really entirely convinced about Jesus at all. How does he know that I don't really yet believe in what he's all about? How could he know this? And it says this. How do you know me, Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you. Now here's an interesting thing. We are not told about what happens with Nathanael under the fig tree. All we're told is that Jesus is saying to him, we're meeting for the first time face to face. But you should know, I know you. I know things about your life. Didn't you sit under a fig tree just recently? You're writing a poem to your girlfriend or something? I don't know what he was doing. Right? And Nathanael is thinking to himself, this person could not know this. And he responds this way. And he says, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel, because you shouldn't know that I just sat under a fig tree recently. Again, we don't know what the significance of it is, other than it gave us insight into Jesus knowing him well. And here's the interesting connection. Notice that Nathanael, when Jesus sees Nathanael, he calls him an Israelite. And as Nathanael is clearly an Israelite, now in this instance, his response to Jesus is, you are King of Israel. So if Nathanael is an Israelite, and he declares Jesus to be the King of Israel, then he's saying, you are the one that I wish to follow. You are now my leader. Jesus said, you believe because I told you I saw you under a fig tree. You will see greater things than that. That's nothing. I'm going to blow your mind. He then added, very truly, I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Can you imagine? Jesus is promising to say, if you walk with me, I'm going to show you the connection between the visible and the invisible. You're going to see things that you've never imagined possible. And he finishes with the last little piece in chapter 1, which is Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. This was his favorite title by far. Of all the titles that he could have chosen, this is the one that he embraced. Why is that? Well, Jesus wanted to help people to understand, I am primarily here under the identity of someone that has joined you. I'm living amongst you. And if I live with you, and if I talk with you, and as you listen to me, you will understand the nature of my Father. You will understand who God truly is. And so this was Jesus' favorite title. We're going to encounter this a few more times in the Gospel of John. So, do you wonder about those 4 names? There's 5 disciples, really. There's one that remains unknown, unnamed. Do you wonder what happened to them? Do you wonder how their story unfolds? Well, come back and hear more about what goes on. But here's the thing. As I was reading this, I was confronted to realize I could name hundreds of stories of people who've decided to follow Jesus and to be about it. I didn't have to look very far. I could just look at my very own family. I look at my parents who made a very deliberate decision to follow Jesus and to literally give up whatever other choices they might have to be about the cause of Jesus. Now here's the more curious part, which stares me in the face like every day. My sister Susan, you know, the one that beat me to Jesus? She married, after we returned to Canada, she went back to Germany because there was this boy. And his name was Walter. And they got married, and he was involved in the metals fabrication industry, and he had a very lucrative career. He was very good at his job. And one day he had an encounter with Jesus. He and Susan were Christ followers, but he had an encounter with Jesus where Jesus invited him to say, do you really want to follow me? Do you really want to be about something? And Walter said yes. Walter went to school, became a pastor. Walter and Susan are now the pastor couple. Guess at what church in Germany? Yeah, back to the church where my parents served for 12 years, which is where I grew up. Walter and Susan serve there today as pastoral couple. My younger sister Judy married a man named Peter. He'd been working for Samaritan's Purse out in Calgary for a long time. They lived in Little High River. Decided as a family they were going to move to Calgary because it was better for their family. And as they moved into town, Judy was looking for a job, and she said, I want to do something that is very clearly about the cause of Jesus. How do I go about doing that? And a position was posted for a church administrator at a small church in Calgary. Any guesses as to what church that was? Yeah, it's the church where my dad sat in a pew one night and made a decision to follow Jesus. When he pulled that $20 out of his wallet and stuck it into the offering bag, he had no idea what he was doing. Right? His life changed forever. He left all that he was familiar with to do something extraordinary. He had no idea that his entire group of children, the next entire generation, would be influenced and affected by this. To be followers of Jesus. My friends, Jesus asks the question, who do you say that I am? The question remains for us to answer. It is your life and mine that will tell the story as to what we believe is true of Jesus. I invite you into that discovery.
So there were quite a few questions. I think we all really loved hearing your story and hearing God work through your life from like generations past. The first question that came in is, it feels like a complicated question, and it's very honest and from the heart. It says, why do we need God in order to be forgiven? Can't I just decide that I'm sorry for making my mistakes and choose to live better moving forward?
Well, that's, I think, an indication of the heart. Your desire is to find a way to deal with the circumstances of the fact that there is sin in your life. There's things that are not pleasing to God that are part of your life. The issue is that within our own humanity, we're limited. There's something that we recognize that within ourselves, we actually don't have a way to persuade ourselves of this, because the guilt remains. And if we don't deal with the guilt, what happens is shame enters the picture, right? Guilt is feeling badly about what we've done. Shame is feeling badly about who we are. Depending on your experience with sin and the devastating nature of it, and perhaps the destruction that it's caused, it becomes a very powerful presence in your life. And so, if we understand that the world that we live in has been created by God and that He has offered to us His Son Jesus as a solution to this reality in our life, then it makes sense for us in the context of creation and our placement in it, that if Jesus has offered this to us, that He is the natural place to go. And so I cheer you on to say, if in your heart there's a desire to say, I want to release myself of this, I don't want to be defined by it, it's a very good start. But I don't know that over the course of your lifetime, you will be able to persuade yourself that your offering forgiveness to yourself is enough without the presence of Jesus also offering that.
It's much bigger than just ourselves. Yeah. There's two questions that came in that are about the application. So I'm going to read them both, and then you can answer one and then the other. The church has so often struggled to embody grace and truth at the same time. It's so easy to live out one of those at the expense of the other. What are some ways to help us remain rooted in both? And I think that's us as a church community in the church. The other question is, in a world of deceit, selfishness, and lack of compassion, how can we make someone understand grace and truth outside of the church? So, as a church body, how can we do that? And then how can we in the world?
Yeah. Well, the truth is that the church has had a default position towards truth. Our history tells us that people have mostly experienced faith community, people who haven't understood it, who aren't part of the community, as a judgmental group of people. And then the hypocrisy of that stares people in the face because, of course, if we claim to be the possessors of truth and then they actually observe our life, they discover very quickly that the truth that we speak of isn't fully true in our lives. And so it's complicated for that reason. It's because our humanity in some ways gets in the way of being able to express a complete and full truth. And so I would say that one of the ways to do this is to believe and to say truth doesn't rest with us, it rests with Jesus. He will define the truth. So if I, as a 9-year-old, come to the understanding that there's sinfulness in my life, it is because there is a truth that He holds to. And the grace that Jesus extends does not dismiss truth. It doesn't actually eliminate truth. What it does, it says, by the truth, you have violated this moral code that I've given and provided, which is to be for your good, in order for you to be in good relationship with me, but also with each other. So you violated this thing. That truth remains. But instead of you living with the consequences of that truth, I will extend to you grace. And this is the thing that Jesus came to do. He took our place so that He could extend grace to us. So in that, what happens is that grace becomes this powerful, compelling thing. And I would suggest to you and I that our best way to live is to extend grace and not to have truth be the first thing that we express, and also to be the owners of truth. I think that's where some of the problems lie, because we don't always get it right. So for us to trust that Jesus is the author, the source of truth, could help us in that regard.
So leading with grace,
Yeah.
and then living out the truth.
Yes.
Okay, thanks,
Yeah.
Bob.
Thanks, Amy.
There were quite a few questions today. I think we all really loved hearing your story from a different perspective, and hearing how God has been working through generations in your family. And there are a lot of questions asking about practicality. So the first one says this: you spoke of people who were following Jesus and then had an encounter that brought them to a different level of relationship. What can a person do to have such an encounter? So many just live at that first level of relationship. How can we go further with it?
Well, first of all, let me say I love your heart, this longing to have such an experience. I would say that our relationship with Jesus is meant to be a vibrant one. It's not something that we start at one particular moment and it never grows beyond. Like it's literally a moving, dynamic relationship. So there are times you may be in a place where you discover what I sometimes call holy discontent. There's something about you that says, I think there's more available. And then in that instance, I would encourage you to not only begin to pray on your own, to be very deliberate about saying, okay, God, if you have more for me, then would you make that really clear? But surround yourself with people that can pray with you. Build a little community of people and say, I have this sense, or perhaps it's a longing to experience something more of Jesus. And then allow people that you trust to come together to pray with you. Be very deliberate to meet on occasion and to talk about it, because it's often the words that people speak into our lives that give us that sense of direction, that sense of clarity, and sometimes the gift of a collaboration like that, when what happens is that one person says a word into your life and another person says it and they didn't know about that amongst each other, and you receive that kind of affirmation, it may just give you directive. And I want to include this. So I talk about my family story, being very involved in church environment. Jesus does not only work with people who are involved in those kinds of environments, but Jesus can work in your life and through your life wherever you're placed. But if you're curious, then I would say pray and gather a community to discern together.
This next question is an extension of that, and I think it goes along with the risk-taking that was kind of a theme throughout your story. So it said, following Jesus may require me to leave my parents or family and go do something somewhere that makes me afraid. What if I want to follow, but I'm afraid of where that will take me? Can I still be a Christian and not leave everything?
That's a very good question. My examples are distorted towards one side. But here's the thing. There is a default. Sometimes, and let me try this out. So in life, you have a decision to make. There is a decision that is easier to make, and there's a decision that's harder to make. There's a conviction within us that says the harder decision must be the right one. The one that costs me more, the one that's more painful, the one that's less comfortable or more uncomfortable, whatever it is. So there's a default, but that has at its core an impression that God is a punishing God. He doesn't wish for us to experience good things. He's always going to demand the hardest things from us. You have to get rid of that line of thinking, because that's not the generosity of God's Spirit at all at work. That's just a human. It's almost like a little bit of a, if I beat myself up, then somehow I will be more pleasing to him. Well, that's a violation of everything that is about grace. So, in this instance, no, you will not have to leave necessarily all the comforts of your life. That is not what Jesus is asking of you necessarily. The truth of the matter is, because he's made us, he understands that there are some things that may be a great gift to us in our lifetime. And I would say that people that serve his purpose are the happiest people. They're not unhappy because they're in these awful circumstances, but they're faithfully slugging along. No, they're happy, and sometimes we are confused because their circumstances strike us to be, how can you be happy in those circumstances? Because this is demanding a lot of you. But if Jesus calls, I think with that call comes our ability to engage it and to do it out of a spirit of generosity, not scarcity. So if you're afraid, the truth of the matter is that when we're saying yes to God, we cannot possibly know what that's going to ask of us. But we can be confident that as he extends the question to us and we respond, that he will be with us whatever we encounter. And he believes that we can navigate whatever comes our way.
Like as we pursue his heart, that our desires will line up with his
Yes.
desires.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks, Bob.
Okay. Thanks, Amy.